Indiana 1993 apartment complex on the city's north side. A 19-year-old woman unlocked her door just before 11 and stepped inside with a man whose name has never been recorded in any official document from that night. Neighbors would later describe soft laughter on the stairwell, casual conversation, the ordinary sounds of a young life continuing forward. Then, after midnight, something in the building changed. A voice, sharp with panic, cut through the walls. "Get off me! Get off me!" Footsteps, a door. Silence. No patrol cars came. No knock followed. Only a typed noise complaint slipped under a door hours later, unaware that the room behind it had already gone still. This story does not unfold with certainty. It moves slowly, through fragments of memory, paper files, mislabeled evidence, and years of unanswered questions. And as we reconstruct the final hours of Carmen Van Huss, stay with the investigation, and if this story reaches you, consider subscribing quietly. As more voices continue searching for what the night itself refused to reveal. Carmen Hope Van Huss was 19 years old. She was 5'2", 115 pounds, with brown hair, a life that had only begun to take recognizable shape. Born October 9, 1973, in Indianapolis. She had grown up between households after her parents divorced, raised largely by her aunt and uncle, but never distant from her mother, father, or younger brother, Jimmy. Those who knew her remembered an easy smile, an affection for animals, and a talent for drawing that filled folders with careful lines and bold colors. Human figures, faces, bodies rendered with attention and patience. By March of 1993, Carmen was living alone in a small studio apartment at Turtle Creek North. She worked as a waitress at a Pizza Hut and was scheduled to open the next morning. On the evening of March 22nd, she visited her grandmother at Community Hospital South with her father and brother. They left the hospital together. At approximately 10:30 p.m., Carmen drove them home. Her father asked her to stay the night. He worried about the drive back across the city so late. Carmen declined. She said she needed to wash her uniforms. That was the last time her family saw her alive. Roughly 11 p.m., Carmen returned to her apartment. Multiple neighbors later told police they heard her climbing the stairs with a man. They said the two were laughing. Nothing in the exchange suggested danger. The man has never been identified. There were no cameras, no license plates recorded, no confirmed witnesses who could describe his face with certainty. Sometime between 1 o'clock and 1:30 a.m., the building's atmosphere shifted. One resident heard Carmen's voice rise sharply through the wall. "Get off me! Get off me!" Others reported muffled noise. Then, at about 1:30 a.m., footsteps moving away from the apartment. No one called police. One neighbor filed a noise complaint with the apartment office instead. Management printed the notice and slid it under Carmen's door the following morning. The door remained unlocked by the afternoon of March 24th. When Carmen failed to appear for 2 shifts at Pizza Hut, her father became concerned. He phoned her repeatedly. There was no answer. He drove to Turtle Creek North. Carmen's car was still in the lot. The noise complaint was still taped to the door. Inside the apartment, he saw the remains of a fast food meal and empty beer bottles. In the sleeping area, just inside the room, he found his daughter on the floor. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been stabbed multiple times. She was partially clothed. She had been dead for more than a day. Police secured the apartment. Photographs were taken. Evidence was collected. A sharp object was identified as the murder weapon, but never recovered. Investigators interviewed neighbors, current and former boyfriends, acquaintances. 2 ex-boyfriends were conclusively eliminated, one by location, the other through DNA. Carmen's killer remained unidentified. The early investigation settled into familiar cold case patterns, questions without sufficient answers, witness statements too thin to sustain charges, physical evidence waiting for technology that had not yet arrived. Carmen was buried on March 29th. On the same day, the grandmother she had visited hours before her death passed away. Years followed. Her father, James Van Huss, died in a car accident in 2002. Her brother Jimmy continued to speak publicly, preserving Carmen's drawings, advocating for movement on a case that seemed frozen in time. If you're watching this and any detail of that night stays with you, the laughter on the stairs, the voice through the wall, the unlocked door, leave a quiet comment below. Sometimes patterns surface only when enough people look at the same darkness. The file would eventually resurface. A detective working outside his assignment would reopen it in his spare hours. Evidence would be mishandled, mislabeled, funds would be raised, returned, argued over, and decades later, the case would finally move again, not because the past had changed, but because science and persistence refused to stop knocking. In the immediate aftermath of Carmen Van Huss' murder, Turtle Creek North did not settle into normalcy. The apartment complex retained a weight, a subtle tension that neighbors could not name. Hallways smelled faintly of disinfectant and carpet cleaner, though the lingering odor often seemed sharper near the stairwell outside Carmen's unit. Residents described a quiet that was heavier than typical, the hum of the city outside muted, almost as if the building itself had absorbed the violence that had occurred. Police returned to the apartment, repeatedly in the days after the discovery. each visit meticulous and methodical, yet yielding little beyond a formal record. Photographs captured ordinary items in a home frozen mid-routine, a pair of sneakers by the door, a small table littered with remnants of a meal, the sketches Carmen had left behind. Investigators catalogued everything: fibers, glass, fragments, the bloodstained floor, but the collection provided no immediate link to the unknown man who had accompanied her that night. There were no forced entry points, no items missing, no witness capable of recalling the face of the visitor with certainty. The ordinary intimacy of the apartment itself became one of the first mysteries in the case. Someone she knew had been invited inside, and that decision had been fatal. Reports of odd occurrences began almost immediately, noted in handwritten maintenance logs and internal memos. Hallway lights near her apartment frequently flickered or failed completely, electrical outlets tripped without explanation. On at least 2 occasions, the building's intercom system emitted static or low-level interference. While these details were formally recorded, they were never directly connected to the homicide. Yet, the timing of these disruptions, coinciding with the days immediately following Carmen's death, has led some to speculate, even decades later, that the building's environment somehow mirrored the disturbance within. Witness testimony was inconsistent, layered with gaps and contradictions. One neighbor recalled hearing Carmen's laughter on the stairwell at a different time than initially reported. Another stated that they could not recall if the voice screaming had been singular or layered with others. A third mentioned sporadic radio interference on a handheld scanner tuned to local police frequencies, coinciding with the estimated time of the assault. These observations were catalogued but ultimately deemed unreliable by investigators at the time, illustrating a tension that would recur throughout the case: the intersection of fact, perception, and memory. The early DNA testing added another layer of complication. Initial samples taken from the apartment were misdirected in the lab. Results returned positive only for Carmen herself, leaving the perpetrator's biological evidence untouched. This procedural failure effectively paused the case for decades. Files were closed and reopened repeatedly, reports were rewritten, and physical evidence languished in storage. The oversight became a recurring footnote, a symbol of missed opportunities that haunted subsequent efforts. It was not until 2013 that the case gained renewed momentum. When Sergeant William Carter of the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department began reviewing Carmen's file in his personal time, Carter was not assigned to homicide or cold cases. He was employed in the nuisance and abatement unit, yet he recognized the potential within the remaining biological evidence. He organized digital records, located the surviving sketches, and examined the inconsistencies in the witness statements. Carter's work was methodical, slow, and meticulous, a forensic reconstruction of both physical evidence and human memory. In 2015, Carter launched a public GoFundMe campaign to finance new DNA testing. The campaign, initially intended to raise less than $1,000, quickly exceeded its goal, demonstrating a public appetite for justice that had remained latent for over 2 decades. Despite the campaign's success, Carter was temporarily removed from the case, a decision later reversed following petitions and press coverage. The funds raised were returned to donors, leaving the evidence once again in limbo. By 2023, advances in genetic genealogy offered the first actionable lead since Carmen's murder. Biological material preserved from the apartment was analyzed using techniques unavailable. 1993. The testing indicated a familial match to a man living near Carmen's former apartment. This lead ultimately pointed investigators to Dana Jermaine Shepard, who would be charged in 2024. Yet the intervening years were filled with uncertainty, the apartment itself becoming a silent witness to decades of unanswered questions. The enduring unease surrounding Turtle Creek North demonstrates how the physical environment can retain traces of violence. Floors and walls, though inert, mark the passage of events. The ordinary beer bottles, discarded fast food packaging, sketchbooks becomes extraordinary in the context of trauma. And as investigators and family members return to these spaces over time, they encounter not just physical remnants, but the echoes of a life abruptly ended. If this story unsettles you, leave a like, a small gesture acknowledging the weight of unanswered time, the persistence of memory, and the long reach of events that resist closure. Carmen Van Huss' life, though brief, was densely layered with ordinary details that mark a young adult's first tentative steps toward independence. Her studio apartment was small, almost claustrophobic, yet within it existed the architecture of her personality: a sleeping area tucked against one wall, a small kitchen with a counter cluttered by everyday objects, and a modest table where she organized her sketches. These drawings, later preserved by her brother Jimmy, reflected a mind attuned to both observation and imagination, figures and faces rendered in sharp color, bodies articulated with care, portraits that alternated between realism and expressive abstraction. They are the surviving traces of a life that would abruptly end before its potential could fully emerge. Born October 9, 1973, Carmen grew up largely with her aunt and uncle after her parents' divorce, yet maintained ties to her mother, father, and younger brother. Family memories describe her as gentle, affectionate, and dependable. She loved animals, dreaming as a child of becoming a veterinarian. By her late teens, she had discovered her passion for art, which she pursued quietly but with intensity. School had been challenging. She struggled with academics and ultimately obtained her GED, but her personal pursuits revealed a discipline and thoughtfulness not always captured in classrooms. The night before her death, Carmen had visited her grandmother in the hospital alongside her father and Jimmy. She sat quietly at the bedside, aware of the fragility of life, a thought that would take on tragic resonance in hindsight. When she dropped them off at home around 10:30 p.m., her father asked her to stay. She declined. The ordinary decision, to return to her own apartment, to do laundry, to prepare for work the following day, would prove fatal. Neighbors later reported hearing Carmen climbing the stairwell with a man laughter. Casual conversation, a scene indistinguishable from the ordinary life she had known. In that moment, everything appeared as it always had. No alarm, no forewarning, just two people entering an apartment late at night. Inside, she shared remnants of a meal, a beer, and perhaps fleeting moments of comfort with someone she trusted. The apartment, mundane and familiar, became a site of violence. Her screams were heard briefly through the walls. "Get off me, get off me." Then footsteps receded. No immediate intervention arrived. The next morning, the noise complaint slipped under her door remained the only record of disturbance. The room contained ordinary objects, now suffused with extraordinary loss. Carmen's family would spend decades navigating grief compounded by procedural missteps and investigative delays. Her father died in a car accident in 2002, leaving Jimmy as the keeper of her story. He preserved her artwork, her sketches, her memory, a fragile, persistent witness to what happened in that apartment. Even as new forensic leads emerged, even as charges were finally filed in 2024, the details of that night, the choices she made, and the absence of immediate help maintained their cold, immutable presence. Carmen's life, frozen at 19, persists not only in records and photographs, but in the textures of her apartment, the sketches she left behind, and the lingering echoes of her presence. Ordinary spaces rendered extraordinary by the violence inflicted and the absence it left behind. By the third decade following Carmen Van Huss' murder, her case file had grown into a layered archive of contradictions, missing elements, and conflicting records. Evidence logs contained items no longer present in storage. Signatures on chain of custody forms varied in ink color and style, and multiple photocopies of reports contained errors in dates or descriptions. These discrepancies were rarely the result of malice. Rather, they reflected institutional drift over 30 years. The natural entropy of records as personnel changed and memory faded. Each inconsistency, however, compounded the difficulty of reconstructing the events of that night with certainty. In 2018, the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department issued its last formal statement on the case, indicating that additional forensic DNA work is being scheduled with an outside source. No specific timeline was given, and no laboratory was named. Between official acknowledgement and practical investigation, the case remained dormant, yet technically active, suspended in a liminal state of partial attention. It was not until 2023 that tangible progress emerged. Parabon Nanolabs, a company specializing in advanced DNA analysis and genetic genealogy, revisited the preserved biological samples from Carmen's apartment. These samples, meticulously stored but decades old, had survived degradation sufficiently to produce usable data. The results indicated a familial connection pointing toward a man residing within close proximity to Carmen's former apartment, an individual who could have accessed the building unnoticed in 1993. Moving along the same stairwell where laughter had once been reported, the lead converged on Dana Jermaine Shepard. By August 2024, he was formally charged with 2 counts of murder and 1 count of rape with deadly force. Additional court records revealed he was a fugitive from another state at the time, underscoring the complexity of tracing his movements and establishing his connection to Indianapolis decades earlier. Shepard's arrest collapsed a distance of 31 years into a single courtroom date, yet many details of the crime remained unresolved. Even with DNA evidence suggesting involvement, fundamental uncertainties persisted. The murder weapon had never been recovered. Early laboratory testing had been mismanaged, leading to prolonged periods without forensic leads. Witness statements from the night of the murder were inconsistent. Timelines varied, voices were misremembered, and the man observed with Carmen remained unconfirmed. In some instances, the accounts contradicted each other in minor but significant ways. Small shifts in time, descriptions of the stairwell, and observations about the visitor's behavior. Physical traces within the apartment continued to evoke a chilling clarity. The unlocked door, the discarded meal, the beer bottles, and the table cluttered with sketches formed a tableau frozen in time. Even after decades of passage, these ordinary objects served as evidence and memory simultaneously. As though the room itself bore witness to events the city had overlooked, investigators continued to parse every document, photograph, and lead. Each contradiction, each uncertainty, underscores the difficulty of establishing a seamless narrative of the night Carmen Van Huss was killed. It is a story defined by partial truths, gaps, and the persistence of absence, the absence of witnesses, the absence of the killer's immediate apprehension, and the absence of resolution for the family who waits still. If this unresolved wait leaves you unsettled, leave a comment, a recognition that even decades later, attention matters, that through collective awareness, the story persists, and the search for clarity continues. Carmen Van Huss' murder remains a shadow stretched across decades. The apartment where she was killed has changed tenants, but the narrow hallways retain the echoes of a voice that demanded to be heard. Files, reports, and photographs trace a timeline, yet gaps endure inconsistencies, misfiled evidence, and unanswered questions that refuse closure. Her brother, Jimmy, continues to preserve her art and her memory, speaking publicly to keep her story alive. Investigators, past and present, have followed every lead possible: witness interviews, DNA reanalysis, forensic review. In 2024, the arrest of Dana Jermaine Shepherd brought hope. Yet even with charges filed, the sense of certainty remains elusive. The crime itself, a single night of violence, is frozen in time, recorded in fragments of observation, in objects touched by her and her killer, in patterns that may never fully align. Forensic reports hint at what occurred, but the human dimensions of fear, trust, and betrayal linger in the empty apartment and the surviving sketches of a life cut short. The faint smell of old beer, the worn kitchen counter, the sketches that line folders, these details form a mosaic more vivid than any courtroom exhibit. Subscribe, quietly, to witness the continuing pursuit of answers, the slow unraveling of decades-old shadows. The city moves on, yet on certain nights, the stairwell outside Turtle Creek North seems to remember, and in that silence, Carmen's voice is still waiting. The door was never locked.